So you've decided to place a wrap-up. You've seen the feasibility studies, you're bought into the concept that placing a wrap-up insurance program to cover all or part of your construction portfolio has the potential to save you money and better manage the risk presented by the construction activity. But what's next? Well, I'm glad you're here. My name's James Pfeiffer. I'm a broker with Turner Surety and Insurance Brokerage, TSIB, and by the end of the next 15 to 20 minutes, you'll have a great understanding of what the next steps are, the timing, and some of the best practices and pitfalls to watch out for as you navigate this process. The first step is to define the risk. What exactly are we wrapping together? Is it a single project? Are we looking at multiple projects? Are you a developer or contractor with a high volume of work that you're looking to enroll into an annually renewing program? Or are you just concerned about a specific selection of projects that you need a single-use solution for? These are all conversations that you'll want to have internally and with the brokerage team involved with this placement. This part of the process should be solid by 120 days prior to binding the wrap-up, and that should take place no less than 2 weeks before construction starts. This next step is all about data collection. All of the carriers that write wrap-ups in the marketplace have their own little nuances on what they want to see in their submissions and the type of information they require, but the following list of items is fairly comprehensive. If you include all of these in your submission, you'll be about 90% there. First, project lists and detailed descriptions of those projects. Project location information is also important. Different jurisdictions have an impact on insurance coverage. Budgets will also be needed. Broken down by various trades will be needed for each project. Those breakdowns will also need payroll estimates broken down by work comp classification codes. Project schedules are also important, when the project begins, when it ends. And if you can, it's always helpful to be able to show escalation when you'll have peak workers on site. Site plans, project renderings, logistics plans, also safety and emergency response plans. Do you have a quality control plan? All this information should be gathered by 100 days before binding. The next step is to work with the brokerage team and build the submission. There are several ways to build a submission, but a good submission should do the following things. First, have a clear objective. It shouldn't be a mystery to the underwriter what you're asking for, or that particularly you're asking for a wrap-up. A detailed description of the operations to be insured is also important. It's somewhere in that submission. Remember, we talked about project lists and project descriptions a minute ago. That's where you're going to be using that information. What your desired program structure is. Is this a 2-line wrap, workers' compensation and general liability? Is it a general liability only wrap-up? What limits do you want? What's the deductible structure that you're interested in? All very important pieces of information that will have an impact on the pricing in terms of the program offered by the carrier. A clear list of exposures that goes back to those trade breakdowns with the contract values and the payrolls. Loss history, if any applies. Also, coverage specifications. You don't want to have an off-the-shelf wrap-up product. You want to take control of the situation as much as you can and specify the exact coverages that you want on your wrap-up. Also, the submission should detail what the risk management process is in your organization. How do you deal with safety, procurement, contracts, that sort of thing. Even a sample copy of your subcontract would be helpful. Last but not least, make sure the submission clearly states the desired quote due date so that your submission for a wrap-up doesn't end up at the bottom of the pile. This part of the process should be completed anywhere between 100 and 90 days before the desired bind date. The next stage in the process is working with the brokerage team again and coming up with a marketing strategy. This is determining which carriers get invited to quote. A lot can go into this discussion. Most obviously would be which carriers are available to write wrap-ups. And of those wrap-up carriers, which ones write the type of risk presented by the projects that we want to include in a wrap-up? Are there existing carrier relationships that we can rely on? The carrier that writes the corporate workers' comp and general liability of your organization may also have a department that can handle wrap-ups. Never hurts to ask. Putting a wrap-up together is also going to create the opportunity for new carrier relationships, which is never a bad thing for an insured. And obviously, the next step, once the strategy is put together, we need to release the submission to the carriers. The timing of this similar to the last portion, should be 100 to 90 days prior to binding. You don't want to go any more than that, especially if this is your first time out putting a wrap-up together. The next step would be to start conducting underwriting meetings. This is an opportunity for underwriters to meet with the insured and to make a personal connection. The last thing you want to be is a faceless name on a sheet of paper. You want to take the opportunity to build the relationships, let them ask questions, find out about you, gain a comfort level from you personally. That's only going to help you in getting the best terms and conditions for your wrap-up. The timing of these meetings, they should be getting scheduled 2 to 3 weeks after the submission release and should be completed no less than 60 days prior to binding. The next step is to conduct loss control or risk engineering meetings. These can be done in conjunction with the underwriting meetings, but they're less about relationship, more about supplemental information gathering for the various carriers. When you submit to the carriers, they are going to require a loss control meeting where their risk engineers are going to want to meet with you, submit questions, bring up topics, and really drill down into how safety and risk are going to be managed on these projects through this wrap-up. These can be done as individual meetings or in groups. I recommend doing these in groups because the underwriting meetings are best done one-on-one since they're more about relationship building. These loss control meetings are more about relaying information. So I say invite as many of the carriers as you can get into the meeting, either in person or on virtual, and solicit those loss control questions and topics that they want to talk about early, so that way the insured can be prepared before the meeting and have the best chance of a productive discussion. The timing of this is the same as the underwriting meetings. Start scheduling them 2 to 3 weeks after the submission, but get them complete 60 days before binding. The next step is the quote review process. At this point in time, the primary carriers for the GL and the workers' comp, if you're doing a 2-line, will have had the submission in hand for a month or more. They'll have had the underwriting meetings behind them, and the loss control meetings will have taken place as well. At this point, they should be ready to release their quotes. Once you have those quotes by 60 days prior to binding, the broker and the insured will review those options. And the brokerage team will likely have a way to level those quote options in a spreadsheet or presentation format so you can see a side-by-side comparison of the different quoted options for both price as well as terms and conditions, both equally important. As long as they make that 60-day prior to binding quote date, that should leave room for at least 1 to 2 weeks of negotiation if you want to haggle on price or get special terms and conditions added to the quote after that initial offering. But the primary carrier, you should look to target selecting that carrier by 45 days prior to binding. This will leave you a good 30 days to get the excess carriers settled. And it's best to have your primary carrier selected so that way you can just tell the excess, here's the primary carrier we're using, please quote on that basis. That makes the excess much faster. And then obviously, once all the excess quotes are in that 30-day period or less, emphasis on the less if possible, another quote review process will take place, and you should be in a position to make a decision on the excess 14 days prior to binding. One thing to keep in mind here, as you're working on the excess, you'll likely have spent a lot of time working on the primary coverage, making sure it meets with your coverage specifications. Make sure you look at the non-followed endorsements that will be disclosed on those excess quotations and make sure that they're not deleting any of the key coverages that you really liked for your primary, because you want those coverages to be carried as far up the tower as you possibly can. Again, the timing for this portion, primary and excess quotes should be done 14 days prior to binding, which would leave you the next 2 weeks to make your final decisions on binding the program. Last but not least, we want to make sure that the wrap-up administration is also engaged at appropriate timing. The wrap-up administrator is the one that handles the day-to-day operations of the wrap-up once it's been bound. They handle things like enrolling the contractors, collecting the various forms and documentation from those enrolled contractors as they come on board. They enroll projects if this is a multiple project wrap-up. They also handle things like payroll collection. This can be done by the broker's in-house team, or it can be done by a third-party administrator. The wrap-up administrators will be key on helping you develop a wrap-up manual, which gets distributed to the contractors and the various parties that get enrolled into the wrap-up. This is, for all intents and purposes, a procedure manual for the wrap, which details the coverages provided and the responsibilities of each party as they enroll into this wrap-up. You'll want to make sure that there's a provision in the construction agreements that makes that wrap-up manual part of the construction contracts. The wrap-up administrators will also help you with developing reports that you'll want to be seeing on a regular basis. The status of enrolled parties. Are all the enrolled parties in compliance with the documents that they have to submit? Once you have the primary carrier selected at around 45 days prior to binding, that's when you should really get engaged on who the wrap-up administrator is and what the various processes and procedures you're going to be dealing with on that. The broker is going to be very instrumental in helping getting that kicked off. So I hope this gave you a good idea of what to expect when you begin the process of deploying a wrap-up on your programs. In summary, the steps in order would be to define the risk, data collection, build a market submission, finalize your marketing strategy, conduct those carrier meetings, both the relationship ones with underwriting and the informational ones with loss control, conduct a quote review and carrier selection process, engage with the wrap-up administrators, and finally, bind that program at least 2 weeks prior to construction start. This whole process ideally should take 4 months leading up to the bind date. It is possible to do it faster if you've done wrap-ups before and you're well known in the industry as a purchaser of wrap-ups. If this is your first time doing it, please take the time to get it right. Take that 4 months. Don't try to rush it. I hope this was helpful for you in giving you a roadmap of what to expect when deploying a wrap-up for your work. If you have any questions or want to reach out to us directly, you can find us on our website at www.tsibinc.com. That's www.tsibinc.com. Have a great day.